The following is a conversation with John Karabin, Chief Cybersecurity Strategist at McGrath Nickel. John brings decades of experience in cyber risk management and governance and shared his insights on combating cybersecurity hubris, addressing insider threats in a hybrid work environment, and staying proactive against evolving cyber risks. Thanks, John, for your time. Subscribe to the Bytes podcast for more conversations like this. There is that overconfidence that comes with some aspects of cyber where you do feel almost, I know enough that I will be wholly secure or as secure as possible. And I feel like that can catch a lot of people out with respect to not really fully analyzing the threat landscape that could get into their environment.
Yeah. And that was the discussion we had before, the hubris side of things. I actually think there's two sides to that hubris. One is the overconfidence, and I see a lot of it in the industry. Some of us just assume the title of CISO, but really hasn't had that long background and tenure to understand all the components, and is naturally wary that they don't have everything perfect. But also the ignorant ones, the ones that just have no awareness and blissfully go about their lives feeling that why would I ever be targeted? And both are equally as dangerous, in terms of missing all the important things that you sort of have to do. So there's a path to experience, and there's a path to being kind of broad-based in terms of starting off and then narrowing down on all those sort of ticks that you have to put into the thing. But it's easy. It's I come across the hubris almost daily in my line of work.
Do you have any kind of insight into some of the common blind spots that, organizations or staff within organizations kind of often fail to recognize those gaps that kind of arise?
Yeah. I'd say the big one is underestimating the threats in the landscape. Some of that is, this goes hand in hand, underestimating the threats, but overestimating the technology that's there to help them. We've got the best EDR. We should be fine. And you find out, of course, you've not looked at your email. Or we're a small company. Why would we ever be targeted? And it turns out they're a supplier to defense, and, there's a nation state kind of sneaking around in the background. So I think that kind of underestimation is regular. We do a bit now in the area of foreign interference, and it's staggering to me how many organizations don't feel that they are potentially in that remit. Critical infrastructure organizations, but just organizations that are doing things involved in infrastructure.
Industry.
Yeah. And I was out having a catch up with a friend last night, and his previous company, they just, the board just had no appreciation for the threat, and it made his job very hard. So he really couldn't convince them that they needed to invest in certain things. So I think that's, it's a big one, and hand in hand with that is the complacency that you tend to see. It's hard to imagine, is it, this day and age, that people are complacent in this space, given the amount of press and compliance requirements, but it's certainly there.
I feel like it's kind of at its root a communication problem, because I think everyone knows there's a risk and they know that the threats are out there coming for them. But trying to speak their language when it comes to what's in it for me is really hard. Like if you look at communication models with, getting feedback or trying to speak to a large audience, they're all completely different and they're not going to hit everyone. So I suppose that's a huge hurdle in leadership, is how do we actually get this information into their heads so that they care?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. The language of information security has been has traditionally been very technical, and there's still a lot of the practitioners that own the security story that still miscommunicate or communicate poorly, let's say, to the executive level. It's great to go to conferences these days, and there's actually, a cyber conference about how to decode malware, but there's right next to them is there's a chapter on how to communicate to the board, how to communicate to your CIO or whatever. And I think they're really, really important lessons, and still a massive issue in the industry. I think equally the leadership, let's call it the CEO and board levels, they're not necessarily communicating down properly either. I mean, some of the big breaches we've seen in Australia and also around the world have been because that top layer just disregards, or doesn't feel that cyber or the approach to cybersecurity is a top priority. And so we see this kind of laggedness in the organizations. And, I've become very interested in culture, and, is culture a reason for some of the problems that we've seen? And you never know because you're not in that environment, but you've got to suspect that culture, ripples down right through to the very bottom layers, that technical layer, and means that people are not as aware or not as focused, or, just don't feel it's their mission necessarily.
It strikes me as well as the further we get away from some of those large-scale breaches that occurred in Australia, a couple of years ago, the more we're kind of setting back in this complacency of, well, they happened. We've done a bunch of stuff since then. Surely we're okay now, right? And I think when Medibank and Optus and things like that were happening, it was very much there's that line of, if you want to get your leadership excited about a disaster recovery process, burn down the business across the street. And that kind of you see the impacts directly affecting someone in your industry down the road. And that highlights how that could affect you. And I think in the absence of this, these are the things that you will have to deal with if you happen to click on a phishing link, or happen to install malware, or happen to do any of the things that, we try to instill within safe use of the internet in the workplace. Yeah. It adds another layer where those gaps just become a lot more prevalent.
Yeah. I think it's a really important point. They're very useful when it's not you, at least, to have a major event in Australia. And of course, the last couple, which were really highlighted because of Minister O'Neill at the time, and the coordination centre under Lieutenant General Michelle McGuinness. Suddenly they became, the industry as a whole and the nation as a whole became hyper aware this is a real thing, and we need to be aware of it. But of course, time diminishes, and I suspect a lot of those big organisations will sort of start to dwindle a little bit in their care factor. Every good CISO will tell you never let an incident go by, and that's super important. I think to highlight the small ones that every organisation's suffering pretty well on a daily basis, and actually make sure they're feeding that into the machine. But I think, the business that you guys are in, the awareness space, testing people by using phishing, approaches and things is super important. And I've become a great believer now in the tabletops and the simulation exercises, because that is like getting the immune booster into the system. It boosts the immunity, keeps everyone a little bit aware, makes everyone sort of look a little bit over their shoulder and just be a little suspicious. But more importantly, it's just checking all the mechanisms, because one of the things we see on a very regular basis is a very poor response when the big one occurs. They're just not ready. They don't have their hot dial number ready. They scramble, they struggle, they can't find the crisis management plans. We talk about feeding lessons learned either through tabletops or through real incidents or through peer groups into that intelligence sphere. So it becomes an active part of how you daily think about, the threat landscape. And if you're a CRO, how you daily think about the risks. If you're a CEO, how you think about the stability and resilience of your organization. If you're a CISO, are all the controls working? That live threat intelligence with not just a feed coming in from the dark web, for example, but feeding in your awareness and so on is super important.
I think you hit the nail on the head there with being prepared. You can have your incident response plan and your business continuity plan and disaster recovery and all that. A lot of organizations see it as an administrative problem when they're preparing those kind of things.
Yeah.
And I think the tabletop situation is a good one because it, as you said, it does engage people and it gets them, their hands dirty a bit with like, who do we call when this happens? But there is a bit of complacency there. Once that administrative part is over, it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So how can you get an organization to prioritize and address those gaps when they're not in like preparation mode? So, it's hard to get an organization to do these tabletops regularly.
Yeah.
And obviously phishing simulations help with employees, but there's still that gap in between the leadership and the employee.
Yeah. Yeah, it's the perennial problem. In cyber, we like to think of our job as being exciting and, a daily buzz and super important. And, the fact that we've forced the business to use multi-factor authentication and they have to keep changing their passwords and, don't click and be suspicious. No matter which way presented, it's a bit of a drag onto the business. And so how do you motivate it? And look, I think there's probably lots of different ways you continue that. Awareness training is super important. Can't always just be phishing type things though. Some of it's got to be storytelling. I'm next Friday. I'm taking our internal business through a talk about an episode from World War II, but describing how human intelligence is actually an important part of threat intelligence. It's a storytelling exercise using another event, but everyone. Hopefully, that day will come away feeling that there's, they can all contribute. And the subliminal messages are, it's everyone's responsibility. If you see something, call it out. Be suspicious. Think about the adversaries and the hackers and things that are trying to come in. And by the way, some of it's going to be insiders, and so. I think the organisation, previous organisation I was with, the CEO made an announcement every now and then. Look, this is really important to our business and to our clients. You need to be diligent. That's a message from the top. She was really good at that messaging and did it sort of quarterly. And then ultimately, you've got to just put technical controls in. Sometimes the technology has to rule, and you have to assume that people will click or people will connect to something that they shouldn't, and so you have to make sure that all those technical controls and architecture, and we talk about it being zero trust, but let's call it defense in depth, if you like. What happens if one mechanism fails? What's your next process to save you?
Yeah, what's that redundancy level? Like, what have you got there in place?
Yeah. And some of it is as simple as, well, do your backups work? Have you regular backups and do they work? We're starting to do a bit more in that area of testing interrelated backup systems, and they really are. They really work all together.
Fully.
And they're problematic, right?
The CISO rules change pretty substantially, particularly over the last 5-10 years. Do you think that a lot more of it now is around that behavioral communication, what the expectations are, while keeping the broad view of the castle's defensive mechanisms, that that defense in depth kind of analogy? Is it balancing those two, or do you generally look more at the castle and hope that the things that you've put in place as the organization will take care of the other problem?
I'm facilitating actually a really interesting panel at a conference in a couple of months, and we've got 5 CISOs, some of them from 5 years back, some of them current CISOs, and we're talking about past, present, and future. So maybe I'll tell you after that. I think clearly the role of the CISO and the functions have changed and are changing quite frequently. It does depend a little bit of which industry you're in. So if you're in a heavily regulated industry like the banking sector, you're more focused in some ways on compliance, bigger sticks for you. If you're a big organization, the CISO is almost becoming, the term is now CSO sometimes. So you're incorporating, risk and physical and fraud and, cyber.
If you didn't have enough consideration.
No, as if you didn't have enough. Yeah. I look, I think those sizes for larger organizations, they've got a big role on their shoulders. They really have to, they become more of a facilitator. I think they're much more of the communicator between the CEO and the board, and then the other groups inside their organization. And they need to become strong leaders of those different groups. Medium-sized CISOs, much more, they're sort of 50-50. They're much more across the controls, the compliance, and they should be oversighting. They're all meant to be the instant controller. We learned this in the fire brigade. Everyone rushes to the fire. Everyone just jumps out of the trucks and they want to squirt water onto the fire. But you actually need someone to step back and watch and have a look.
See what's happening. Yeah.
What's happening, to have the 360 view. They can't get involved. If they get involved, they're going to lose that 360 and that high-level view.
That's one part. Mm-hmm.
And they're the ones to call in more resources. They're looking for the safety, on the fire ground. They're making sure that people don't run out of water. They can call in more resources, and that is now really ultimately what the CISOs become. They're kind of that instant controller during peacetime and during wartime or during an incident. So
I love that analogy.
Yeah, in Australia at least. So the CISO has sort of some legal responsibilities there. Are there any legal consequences if they drop the ball?
On the CISO directly? Yeah, really good question, because you're probably referring to the US, where there has been...
There's been a lot of talk about there being actual legal consequences personally for those in that role. So I was wondering if that was the same here.
No. So the answer's no, but I guess we've still got to see how the US plays out even. I think those cases in the US have been a little bit misunderstood. Some of them have been due to the fact that the CISO has directly got involved in making announcements that impact the value of the share. So they've effectively misled.
Okay.
And, there's a discussion, I suppose, whether they represent an executive level or whether they're, under that. I think in Australia, there's been no cases, and CISOs generally would not be held liable unless there's fraud involved. Clearly, then, all bets are off. But in terms of a regulatory compliance perspective, the only ones that are really on the hook are the board. So, of course, with some of the penalties now coming through, if they're negligent, and we haven't heard what that actually means from a cyber perspective, they could be held personally accountable, as well as held accountable for the industry. So we have seen fines occur, of course, at the board level. We haven't seen any punitive criminal penalties applied. But CISOs at this stage, they'd be named and shamed, I'm pretty sure, if they were, negligent. But even with the big breaches that have occurred in Australia, we haven't heard much about that from the CISO perspective. They have been largely shielded, and the high-profile headhunting has occurred with the CEO levels, of course, which is maybe appropriate ultimately.
How do you feel that an organization can stay proactive in their defenses, given the constant kind of increase in not only the scale of attacks, the lack of technical information required to execute on attacks now with AI, more and more 0 days on the market? What's a kind of basic thing that you think organizations can do, or CISOs in particular, to say proactively ahead those threats?
Yeah, look, I don't think there's any one single answer. I think it has to be varied, regular, and adaptive, depending on the environment, the threats, the circumstances of your own organization. Yeah, so this is hard. I mean, it's a good question, because we get it a lot. We'll go in and they'll go, help us. And like, you can't start a strategy plan and a roadmap until you've done a risk assessment and a baseline. So I suppose my answer is you always need to know where you are today. What are the assets you've got? And actually, on that very point, one of the things we're finding a lot at the moment is there's a real lack of understanding of where the data is and what data people have. So that's frequently as part of that very early risk assessment. What assets, what are the crown jewels, and where are they? We always do a paper assessment first, and then we might go in with some tools to have a look around, and they never match. Like we always find something that they don't recall or think
they don't know was there.
they didn't know was there. It's a bit like my back shed, right? There is stuff in there I've forgotten about. I know there's some good stuff in there, but so I think that initial phase, and then they need to actually have a definitive framework that is actually useful for them. And I think this is a really important point, actually. We get smaller organizations and they feel like they've got to do a 27001, or maybe they've got to comply with the ISM. And some of these frameworks are just too big. They're too complicated, they're too big, and they're just not right for that organization. So a framework's a guideline that you can measure against, and you've got to really match that up against who you are. And like we're doing a lot with what's called the S&P 001 now, which is set up for small to medium businesses. It's a really good overarching standard that covers policies, practices, and technology, but for small organizations. And it covers things like business email compromise, which they're getting hit with on a daily basis. It's a really, really massive problem. And so, yes, they want to be, they might ultimately, if they're in the critical infrastructure, SOCI, covered by SOCI, they're going to have a risk management plan and an incident response plan and all the other things, and they're all super important. But, complying with NIST or 001, is a big and long process. So I think that's sort of appropriate. And then what you guys do, I think ultimately having an awareness plan or policy or approach that varies, the storytelling, the fishing, just to keep people refreshed that this thing, it doesn't go away. It's we've just done a survey with a whole bunch of clients in Australia, and cyber's become the number one risk. It's not a real surprise. It is a surprise in a way. I posted this on LinkedIn. It's a surprise that it seems to still be growing. The question is why? Because there's so many good technology providers out there. They all promise that they'll solve the problem, and yet the problem's getting worse. So the real question, I think, in my mind, why is that gap sort of still appearing to grow a little bit larger?
The scale of everything has really popped off significantly with the introduction of generative AI. I feel like the barrier to entry for a criminal or an average cyber criminal is a lot lower now than it once was. And, I do wonder as well, you mentioned earlier in conversation around insider threats. I wonder how much those two play off each other as well, where, the opportunity is there, the justification or rationale is there, and then they just do the thing without kind of putting too much stock into how much of an impact they may have later down the track.
No two ways about it. AI is a game changer in how we all operate, how we think, and there's been many conversations how it's impacting cyber. And there's multiple streams we could talk about on that one, I suppose, in terms of how AI will be used to test vulnerabilities. The criminal gangs will have a lot more tooling, if you like, to do that. But I think on the insider one, it will not surprise me to see that growing as a growing threat landscape, if you like. And it's because, and we hit on this early on. I think we were recording at the time. AI, large language models are based on our media, on things that we do and like and have interest in. And even if we're not consciously interested in things, we're subconsciously interested in things. And once you gather that all in, it becomes much easier to either manipulate someone inside an organization. And once you do that, of course, once you're in, that's the 80% of the effort. Or on the flip side, it enables you, maybe as a nation state or a very sophisticated criminal, to act as an insider. And so once you start thinking like an insider, you don't trigger as much of the kind of standard technology, because
Especially with hybrid work as well, working from home, you don't personally know every single person you work with anymore.
Precisely. So it's not even strange to get an email from someone that you're not aware of, but suddenly it's come in on your corporate email and it's contextual and sort of suggests, oh, look, I bet can you just change your bank account details because we've changed banks, or just these subtle but contextual prompts to do stuff. And I think AI has absolutely shown itself to be really good at that. It's based on our algorithms of who we are, and so I think that having to have an insider risk management plan and process will be as important as having a sort of an external facing one. Now, the two will have to be hand in hand in terms of your risk approach.
And what are some of the strategies that an organization could, I guess, employ to detect risk insiders or see someone kind of teetering on the edge? Because it's obviously something that when you're looking outside the organization, you go kind of take a bit more liberties around. There are scammers out there. It's a much harder psychological kind of hill when it's people you work with or are in the organization.
Yeah, it's not us versus you, is
suspicious. Yes, it's the calls coming from inside the house. So what sort of behaviors are like things that could potentially tip you off to someone having a nefarious intent?
Yeah. Well, let's go to the human ones first, and that is training your people. That is being transparent with how you're operating and
like the structure of the organization. I mean, there should be a clear chain of command and access points.
Precisely. So understanding the roles, responsibilities, limiting it. We talk about in cyber, flat networks are really dangerous networks, and so are human networks. You need to have those roles, responsibilities, and that needs to connect in with what you can access and what you can do. I think training people to look for the insider. So it's okay to ask someone if you're walking through a door, can I see your pass? It's okay to do that, right? It's not being mean. If you see someone doing some suspicious stuff, being able to report it, all those sort of aspects become really important. And the work from office, work from home type thing has obfuscated us a little bit from being in touch with the people around us. And if you think of the big breaches, the Snowdens and that, the big insider breaches, a lot of them have been partly done on manipulation, of people around them and people not calling out suspicious activity. All that said and done, that's only going to stop some things. And I think you do need to start going into that technical sphere as well. So we call it, least privilege. So cleaning up access. This is a huge issue at the moment with SharePoint, for example, and Office 365. When it first rolls out, pretty well everyone has open access to everything. And one of the organizations I was with, they started enforcing ownership of each of those pools of data. It was a real pain. It took months and months and months, but it was super important to start categorizing ownership and deleting stuff that wasn't meant to be there. And then I think there's specialists in this area. We run frameworks, for example, on insider risk. People telegraph certain things. So, for example, if you're just been told you may be redundant or you're about to resign, there's certain things you tend to do, right? You might be sending a few more things via, to your Gmail. You increase the amount of printing that's going on.
You add everything to your Dropbox and save it for later.
Exactly. So there's a whole bunch of things that sort of indicate, and organizations should have a policy around that. So some of it's just policy, by the way. You're not allowed to do this. We're going to remind you. And when you leave, we'll remind you again. But some of it's also about detecting this stuff. And quite frequently, organizations will have a policy that goes, the size will have a direct line to HR, and HR will say, well, these 5 people are going to be made redundant in the next week, and they might start additional monitoring from that point, just to keep an eye on things. So, there's a lot in the area of user behavioral, this is where I think AI will actually be quite useful, kind of looking for those breadcrumbs of indicators. And given another aspect of our business is in the forensics and the fraud, internal fraud, those two, they cross over a lot. And probably one hint on that one, make sure you've got the right sort of logging processes internally, because at the end of the day, you've just got to find out what's happened. And our teams find it immensely difficult with some organizations who delete all their logs or don't hit the right.
Have logs.
Just can't tell, right? Just can't do much when that happens.
And I imagine similarly that AI is definitely going to be used for a lot more of that behavioral analysis of what employees are doing, kind of at an aggregate level compared to others. Capture as a first thing comes to mind, where the "I'm not a robot" thing is not actually about you clicking on it; it's about the direction your cursor takes around it to click on it.
Yeah.
So that analysis of how we're interacting with these digital devices will give us some sort of inference around the thing.
Yeah.
To that point, though, about logs not being always there or logging the right thing, is that relatively common with respect to coming in, assessing an organization's way of doing things, realizing, oh, none of this is turned on. That's like step one type of thing.
Massively. Yeah. Massively. It goes right back to the very first point about hubris and perhaps naivety a little. People just don't think it's going to happen to their organization. They generally assume everyone's good and there for the right reasons, and majority are, of course, but it does take effort. You have to collect the right logs. There's a price to pay because there's, you're storing these things. You've got to have them. They're often going to be used and collected for evidence in a court, and so there's got to be some degree of integrity checks and so on them to prove that they were time-stamped and can't be changed. And so it's a little bit of a specialist area in some ways, but again, I would say at the very early stage of doing your risk assessments and your sort of strategy plans, thinking at least about that and what you need to store, and actually how long you need to store it for. And do you store, and you'd have to be careful. You don't want to store personal information that could be deemed inappropriate as well. So you got to think about that sort of stuff. But storing metadata 1, 2, 3, 4 years, it should be considered. We always said priority when we go into an organization is hygiene. You want to make sure you're ticking at least most of the boxes, and then second priority often is then logging, just making sure you've got enough checks and measures internally, and not the least, some of the big breaches in Australia, the criminal gangs and nation state people have gotten in. They move laterally. They use the tools off internal tools, and so the only way you find out what they've done and where they've gone is checking those very, very specific logs, and that will give you an assessment of, did they take data? Did they, if they set some backdoors, what actually happened here? Because if you don't know any of that, it's going to happen again.
I think it's really fascinating knitting that story together.
Yeah. It really it sounds really obvious, and we use things like MITRE, the MITRE attack chain, to sort of go through the sequence of how criminal groups do this. But of course, it's not done very often, surprisingly not. And coming back, Benji, to your question, it's more common not to have the right logs when we go in and do a forensics job than to have everything perfect. When I look at the stress and strain on our teams, I'm down on the open floor, and they've become experts at looking at almost dissociated bits of information to try and stitch together the story, and it takes quite a skill actually to do all that.
And I don't know if you can speak to it at all, but how much of that is using AI tooling or anything around the kind of large analysis scale of things, or is it very human, methodically going through line by line?
It's a little bit of both. I'd say the AI side in that is probably yet to really be focused on that. I will say AI is probably coming into its own to some of that anomaly detection. We're working with one or two companies at the moment that have their own secret sauce around AI, and they're training the algorithms themselves, but forming approach using large language modeling as well, and so that they are picking up indicators. This has been the nirvana, by the way, of insider risk, is to have user behavioral technology that actually works and actually doesn't give you a million alerts, but gives you the 10 that you need. But I think coming back to your other question, the forensics thing is still pretty humanoid driven. Yes, we've got a lot of analytics tools, but some of these people are really smart, lateral thinkers, and can put a couple of things together that us normal humans can't. And so the role of the detective, and if there's anyone out there that loves the detective stories and that, there's a huge market for sort of that digital forensics side versus instant response. This is sort of in our business, it's quite a clean kind of separation in some ways between those two, just because of the skill sets that we see.
Yeah, it is pretty fascinating. Like you said, with the old detective stories, you might have a detective out surveilling someone, and they'll figure out what time they eat their breakfast, what time they leave for work, what route they take to the office, whereas a digital forensics person will have all this data on a user that is pure data. Like you might not know who that person is, but you know exactly like how many times it takes them to log on, or when they log off during the day, do they log off? Do they make their computer sleep? What systems do they access? And it's I don't know, to me, that's quite exciting, finding all those little invisible threads, linking it all together.
Yeah. No, and, I think that's why we need diversity of thinking in the industry, because you still need to relate to people and how they operate in the digital world. And I think sometimes the pure technical cyber side has forgotten that. They're right into this is an amazing bit of malware. It's using a 0-day that we've never seen. And, they found this one flaw in the Intel CPU processor. And, you actually need both, funnily enough. And the more that digital and the transformation that we're going through with everything, every one of our services interrelated from a digital perspective, you need to have smart people that understand the human algorithm, the human and machine side. And, we're lucky. We're starting to see that bring together of all sorts of diverse groups. Where we work with a lot of legal firms now, and, they bring a legal framework to an incident, which, it's not what we were used to from an incident response perspective, but super important to have that framework in place with the legal kind of framework as well.
There's definitely an element as well there's definitely an element to me as well of like the more of these companies that kind of create their own internal GPT infrastructure, AI infrastructure, the more kind of promising those crown jewels become in a lot of ways, because you've almost like put it together on a silver platter in a lot of ways. So it does open up another consideration of the value that can be derived from that giant analysis that isn't connected to OpenAI or, whoever else. But it is just kind of sitting there waiting for someone to take advantage of it. So it kind of opens up another layer of, considering
it does
how to protect those things.
It's a really, really interesting point. And there are companies forming around this area now to help organizations put guardrails around the AI source, let's say, because, we're really comfortable with PII. If driver's license and birth date and your health records, they're obvious records or data blobs, crown jewels that are super important to protect. But what about that AI that, is effectively your digital twin that knows everything about likes and dislikes and your fears and your personal concerns and issues. And, that is probably more revealing than your health records in many ways. And that sort of analysis is starting, those data globs are starting to come together. And, I'm pretty sure there's no fine print that says we'll delete this if you ask us to, or, we'll keep it super safe, we'll have it encrypted, all that sort of stuff. So I think you're right, Benji. There's probably rapidly coming front of more problems in personal information getting out and being, highly damaging to people that lose it.
Yeah, you could interrogate that AI just with plain text and it will just happily tell you what it knows.
Absolutely.
Particularly if you're already in the organization, you
Exactly.
enterprise someone. Now you can just start asking all this information.
Hey, tell me this. Okay.
Processes.
Yeah. Don't worry about
I find that fascinating.
Yeah, I think you're on a real, a really important one that is going to grow, no doubt, in terms of, another vulnerability. Most of us in the industry offer services around sort of the executive briefings and, starting to go to executives and saying this is why you might be targeted and this is how you might be targeted. Quite informative to many of those people, but you won't need to do that going forward if that person's revealed enough to their social media platforms and things. You just go for the digital image of them. It's probably more revealing, in fact, than trying to, an adversary trying to take the human out of the equation. So be very careful out there with TikTok and Instagram and Facebook and you name it. Just be careful.
Stay safe, kids.
Stay safe, kids. Yeah, stay safe.
I guess it's really just about being hyper aware that anyone can get got, right? Jeff Bezos has been spearfished.
Yeah.
Last pass engineers, senior devs have been spearfished. So I think the hubris in cyber is something that, to me, has been something very interesting to observe. The way highly technical organizations speak about that. I learned a term recently, security theater.
Okay.
Not to downplay what some organizations are actually doing, because I'm sure it's absolutely relevant and is there with the end goal of securing things. But I do wonder how much of the industry does do that kind of, we're secure. Yeah, look at us.
Well, we know it does.
Well, tugging at the arrows.
Yeah. We absolutely know it does do that. And I think another interesting point, I don't know if we'll ever see this survey, but I did go to a conference once and they spoke about how the security people themselves, how vulnerable they were. And, it's almost a surprise because you think we're naturally suspicious of everything, which I think a lot of us are. But, that in its own right allows a particular threat and angle. And they talk about these sort of things at Black Hat, frequently about the spear phishing or the approach that's tricked the cyber specialists themselves. And that's actually quite frightening. And it constantly reminds us, I think, to the beginning of this conversation, hubris is really important, and probably the blinkeredness, the bias, and perhaps if there's anything I can leave, it's that, especially the more senior you are, the CISOs, they really need to become the incident controllers, because that is the only way you can kind of open yourself up a little bit to see the bigger picture, just because we have a natural human, sort of focus, and that's our weak point in some ways.
Always mind those gaps. Am I right, John?
Mind those gaps. So, I had to laugh at that. I was in Sydney just last week, and I was at the train station and looked down right at my feet, and there was a big sign reminded me that should be the new cyber hashtag, I think.
Mind the gaps. I love it. Thank you so much for your time. We learned a lot, and we look forward to maybe catching up again at a future date. You can tell us all about the results from those surveys.
Indeed. Well, pleasure. Very, very nice to meet both of you.
Yeah, thanks very much.
All right.
Thanks,
See you later.